And we are live with Nick Underhill of the New Orleans Advocate. He's also the host of the podcast Saints Talk, which you can find at saintstalk.com. Nick, how are you doing today?
Hey, I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming on. We really appreciate it. Let's get right down into it. Some of the biggest news out of New Orleans this offseason was Mark Ingram's 4-game suspension for PEDs. We know he's already tried appealing it, been denied, and now there's a serious backfield void for those first 4 weeks. So we got a couple questions about that one, and the first being, does this impact rookie sensation Alvin Kamara at all? Will he inherit a solid chunk of this work, or is he going to be similarly used to begin the season?
I think he'll probably get a little more work. I mean, in the Sean Payton era, I think last year in maybe 2006, Deuce McAllister, Ingram and McAllister both averaged a little bit more than 14 carries per game. I don't see them busting that trend that much. I think they want to be careful with how much they use Alvin throughout the season. I would guess maybe 20 touches per game, which is kind of about where it was at the end of the season last year, the last 3 games. He had actually moved ahead Ingram a little bit, in touches per game over those last 3. So I think it'd probably be something like that. And then, they'll try to find someone else to step up and kind of fill in, some of those other carries. But as far as, him becoming like a carries monster or anything like that, I don't see that happening those first 4 games.
And that's kind of a perfect segue then to the next one is who would step up then and kind of share that role in those first 4 games? Is there anybody kind of emerging? Who are the candidates and kind of who do you see as the favorite to take that role over?
I don't know when this is coming out. We might have some more clarity after Friday's game against Arizona. Right now, I would say the momentum's behind Jonathan Williams. I don't want to say he's the front runner. I'm not sure there is a front runner yet. It's been kind of hard to evaluate that because they haven't tackled to the ground in practice. And you kind of look at last year, we knew Kamara was good during training camp. He had some good carries and everything. Had no idea he was special until kind of got into the preseason and then into the season, because the thing that made him really good is that he's impossible to tackle. So without kind of seeing that in practices, it's been hard to gauge. If you asked me a week ago, I would have said Terrence West was maybe the front runner, but then he got in this game and it was unimpressive. And then Williams came in at the end of the game and he looked really good. So I think they need to see him against better competition, 1s and 2s on the defensive side and then maybe behind the better offensive line. But it looks like, if I had to guess today, he'd kind of be the guy, but, he might squander that opportunity against Arizona.
And if, let's say he comes in and kind of dominates for those first 4 weeks, looks really good, would that impact Ingram at all coming back from the suspension, or would he kind of just be inserted right back into the role he had last year? Is there any way to predict that? What are your thoughts on it?
I want to tell you that's a crazy thought, and it's nuts to even bring up, and I would have told you that last year. Hey, what happens to Willie Snead after those first couple games when he's suspended for the DUI, and then Willie, who I thought was maybe one of the most important players in the offense just due to his chemistry with Brees, gets replaced completely and never reclaims his spot at all throughout the whole season. Probably one of the bigger mysteries that still remain around this team. And someday I hope that, Sean Payton explains that maybe after he retires or whatever, because I would love to know what happened, because that made no sense to me. So, I mean, is it impossible for a similar situation? Ingram's in the last year of his deal. If Jonathan Williams is amazing those first 4 games and they look at him as someone who can be part of the future, you never know. I mean, in these practices, I will say, you see Ingram take a handoff and he just looks completely different than any of these other guys that are trying to step up and take his place. But, you never know.
And the last running back, just before we move into kind of the aerial attack, is Boston Scott, the rookie coming in this year. Just an intriguing talent. Has he looked good in camp? Is there any chance of him carving out a role in this offense? What have you seen from him?
Yeah, I think he's going to get better reps too, moving forward throughout the preseason. He's he's intriguing. He runs well, he moves well. He's had some flash plays. I think he's probably a better pass catcher than probably anybody but Shane Vereen, as far as those other guys kind of competing to get in. And he's also in the mix for the kick return role, and he had a good return last week against Jacksonville. I think Brandon Tate's probably a little bit ahead, but they're going to try a ton of guys out in that role. And I mean, it's not unreasonable to think that Scott could potentially, that could be his way onto the roster. And then if he sticks, I could see him doing some things in the running game for sure.
Awesome. Good. Thanks for all that analysis. And now let's talk about the pass game a little bit, which was obviously last year much different than we've seen many years prior. So since 2010, I did a little digging. 7 straight seasons, the Saints never were below number 7 in passing play percentage, or 62%. But last year, behind that high-powered backfield we've been talking about, they fell all the way to 20th in passing game play percentage with 56.3%. And Brees also only had he had his lowest touchdown total since 2003 and had a streak of 32 or more TDs broken, a 9-season streak of that. So the air game got taken out a little bit just because of how successful that running game is. Do you see that changing at all in this 2018 season, or is it kind of a it ain't broke, don't fix it type of situation?
I think that's probably two things. The defense, if the defense is as good as it was last year, I think they're going to try to remain as balanced as they were. And I think that defense is more talented than it was, I think it should be more talented this year than it was last year. Marcus Williams, the safety, I mean, a lot of people probably just remember him from the one play against Minnesota, but he had 5 picks during the season. He really, really good rookie year. And he's come back and like his instincts and everything. He's like, man, you could argue that he's one of the 2 or 3 best players in their camp right now. And if they have a free safety going like that and Marshawn Lattimore takes the next step and he can shut down his side even more than he did last year after allowing a 45 passer rating against, I mean, there's not a whole lot of field to work with. And now they added Demario Davis to the linebacker core. They haven't had a linebacker with range in probably 4 or 5 years, unless you count the couple games that Donnell Ellerbe played. And, their pass rush looks better. So if all those things come together, I think their offense might kind of remain in the same place. And then also that disparity in the pass/run. I mean, a lot of those passes, their screen game was as prolific as it's probably been at any point in the last 12 years. It was a ton of screen passes last year. And, those are essentially an extension of the running game. So, that run pass disparity is really, really, really crazy when you think about it. I mean, their offensive philosophy just changed so much last year. And, if, in the perfect world, if they're throwing a lot more than they were last year, that means, it's great for fantasy owners. It means the Saints probably suck and their defenses went in the tank and, they're not winning games. So, they're hoping to be balanced, and I'm guessing the guys, drafting their weapons are hoping that they aren't. But
yeah. One weapon that's definitely going to be highly drafted, other than the run game we talked about, is Michael Thomas. He's been an absolute monster these last 2 seasons since joining the league. Kind of the clear-cut number 1 guy these past 2 years as well. Even though his 5 touchdowns last year are a little bit disappointing, but so many yards, so many catches, you can't really complain. How's he looking right now? Is he going to kind of maintain that dominant wide receiver 1 role? Is there any chance more touchdowns happen? What do you think of Michael Thomas in his 3rd year here?
Yeah, he somehow looks even more physical than he has been the last 2 years, and that's kind of the nature of his game. But I don't know, he just looks stronger and more explosive than he has the last couple of years coming into a season. I do think that the touchdowns are a little bit of a disparity. 5 just seems it's kind of like hard to even fathom how that happened, because he's definitely their best target down in that area of the field. So I would expect that probably to go up a little bit. It's going to be interesting though. Like, does he hold steady? Does he improve? Does he drop back? If I had to bet on it, I would probably bet on the numbers taking a little bit of a step back. There's just never, that was the first time ever that one guy has ate up so many targets. And, the argument is, well, he's probably the best wide receiver that the Saints have ever had, in this Drew Brees era. And that's a fair argument. But I think if Cam Meredith is healthy and pans out, Raekwon Smith has looked really good. Ben Watson is, he's not, a huge difference maker, but he's a tight end that can catch passes, which is something they didn't have last year. Like, in a lot of ways, Thomas was the only player, it felt like, on this team. And then the other thing I would say, too, is at the start of last year, he wasn't really treated like a number 1 receiver by a lot of teams. That week 1 game against Minnesota, they didn't have Rhodes on him really at all. He played aside, and a couple times they matched up, and then by the end of the season, you were starting to see more teams gear their coverage towards him. Rhodes, matched out or shadowed him in the playoffs. And I just think moving forward, he's going to garner more of that respect league-wide. He's not nobody's sleeping on him anymore. So I just think a lot of those different factors could lead to him not getting, 149 targets. I could just see that number going down a little bit.
And you mentioned a lot of names that do intrigue me. They've added a lot of weapons there. Cam Meredith probably being the most intriguing if he can get on the field. We kind of love his potential as a Marquise Colston almost body and style of play. I don't know if there's a way to really assess him, though, because I know he's been missing a lot of time. But what do you expect from him being in this offense, and what kind of impact do you think he could have with the Saints?
Yes, that's kind of the problem. You look at his tape and the stuff he did 2 years ago. He looks like the type of player that would fit him perfectly in this offense, in that role, kind of in the slot. That's another thing with Thomas too. He got a lot of targets out of the slot, and it kind of got him off some of that coverage every now and then. And if they have Meredith in there, he might not get those same amount of looks. So that's another thing, maybe working against Thomas, repeating his numbers. But because I say that, he'll probably blow those numbers out of the water. But yeah, I do think Meredith could be in that role if he's healthy and he comes back. Yesterday, I don't even know what day of the week it is. Wednesday. On Wednesday was his first time back from a strained oblique. So it wasn't the knee that was keeping him out of practice, which is a good thing. But when he's been out there, he's looked good. It's just we haven't seen a whole lot of him out there. But he's definitely, if you can get him, he's somebody that seems like could be a good value pick, and I could see him having a good year here as long as he is healthy.
Do you consider him being kind of the number 2 on the target totem pole behind Thomas, or would somebody else like Ted Ginn, who had a solid but unspectacular debut last year, still maintain that number 2 role? Do you think?
So tough to say. I mean, Raekwon Smith has been so good too that I could see him. That there's a scenario where if he makes that run up, I feel like Raekwon and Cam Meredith, they're kind of more like in direct competition with one another.
Okay.
And there is some overlap between Raekwon and Ted Ginn because Raekwon can get deep and do some of that stuff too. But I feel like, the Saints have always kind of had that burner, the Devery Henderson type. I feel like that's kind of like Ted Ginn. He's in that role. So, and Raekwon, man, like, there were stretches during this camp, weeks at a time where it just felt like he had like 2-3 incredible highlights every single day. He's maybe come back to earth a little bit, but he's still showing up quite often. And if Meredith isn't playing, there's a scenario where, Raekwon jumps ahead of him, and then, in some of these looks, when they're 2 receivers, he could be the other guy out there. So that's a tough one to gauge. I really think it's a 3-headed race there.
Could you just describe Raekwon just a little bit for some of our listeners who might not be aware of him? I know he's the rookie that came in, but kind of what's his motto? Is he a speed guy? Is he a big body? In case any of our listeners don't know exactly who Raekwon Smith is yet, could you maybe just paint a little picture of him for us?
I think he's probably a guy that does a little bit of everything. I don't know if he's special at anything yet. That's to be determined, but he runs the whole route tree. He can get deep, makes contested catches. I think last year in college, I think he led the nation in yards per reception, and some of that's that their offense that they ran. It's no huddle. He was getting some advantageous looks, but he was getting deep, and he runs the trees. He's competitive. He just looks like a very, very good player, and I don't want to compare him to Mike Thomas or anything, but like there were stretches where his dominance like kind of made me think back to that first camp. Now Mike sustained it from day 1 to day 28 or whatever it was, and it was every single day, and then every single day he had like an insane highlight, and it was like a super incredible camp. But I mean, there's some isolated moments like where it kind of felt like he had that momentum behind him, and like I said, he's come back to earth a little bit, but I think he's going to be impactful throughout the season. I don't know, how does that manifest? Is it, coming into this, if you kind of look back at the old Saints offenses, I would have guessed that maybe he would have been like Robert Meacham, in 2009, kind of like the 4th guy that comes in and gets 600 and some yards, 700 yards. But, maybe there's a chance he does a little bit more than that.
Awesome. And then the last guy in the pass-catching core is kind of old faithful Ben Watson. You mentioned he's returned, and I know he's now 37 years old. Kind of doesn't seem quite the ridiculous athlete he used to be, but still been a reliable guy for the Ravens last year. And then just 2 seasons ago was a very reliable threat for the Saints. 7-4 catch, 825 yards, and 6 TDs. Do you expect them to recreate any of that type of magic, or what are you seeing from Watson so far?
He's been steady as ever so far. I mean, he was hurt too, but he came back and kind of picked right up where he left off, and it just kind of looks like Ben Watson. And the biggest thing I would say he has working for him is that there's a lot of tight ends in this camp, and Dan Arnold, he's a converted wide receiver. He's somewhat of intrigue, like as a possible flex. I don't think that impacts Ben much, but like all the other guys, Josh Hill, Hooman, and then they got another rookie, Deion Yelder, and then Garrett Griffin. He's kind of hung around for a few years as a UDFA. None of these guys have stepped up really at all, and I think that's the kind of the thing the Saints were looking for, is hoping that someone would kind of step up and claim a role, and then that could potentially cut into some of Watson's targets. I haven't seen that happen at all. I feel like there's Ben and then there's everybody else and it's flat. So it seems like he's probably going to have a good amount of opportunities. And when Drew Brees trusts his tight end, that tight end typically puts up decent numbers. And I think him and Watson do have that level of trust. Like you said, at 37, what does that look like by the end of the year? I don't know, but he can still move and he's still making catches.
And he's getting undrafted in fantasy leagues right now, so that's someone that's got to be on radars. Is there anybody else that we haven't discussed yet that should be on any fantasy radars? I know we've covered pretty much everybody that I can think of. Anybody else that should be on our radars, though?
Yeah, I think I just kind of mentioned. I don't know, if you can pick them up and stash them or just keep an eye on them once the season starts. Dan Arnold just, is that flex tight end. If he does manage to make the team, he might or might not. But, in that 2-minute offense, that's kind of where Coby Fleener got all his yards, all his touchdowns. And if Arnold can, block just enough to justify a spot on the team, I could see him getting some of those targets.
Awesome. And last question here would be, what is your just predictions for the Saints coming off a great year last year? What's your predictions for the season as a whole, and then just the NFC South as well in 2018?
I'll pick the Saints to win it at 11-5. I think honestly, if they're in like the Final Four of the NFC, that's a disappointing season for them. I think the expectations are that high, and I know everybody else in the division or in the conference has gotten better, so it's going to be a tall task. But I would pick them to win the South, and then I don't know who I would take next. Carolina, maybe. I don't know. It's always so tight. It could be anybody, not the Bucs. I'll just say not the Bucs in the second spot.
Right. Awesome. Well, Nick, thanks so much for the time. We really appreciate it, and enjoy the rest of camp and the 2018 season.
All right. Thanks for having me, man.
All righty. Thanks.